It was all cityscapes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was your trio?
Trio.
Trio.
19th century. Right? I think the whole, the only way you can understand the changes in art and the whole the dependence on a certain kind of style or certain subject matter or whatever is two things. I think that one is that the artist is never interested in anything which he doesn't think is real. And when he thinks something is real, it's apt to be something which he thinks of as divine. And that the
peacock agrees.
What?
The peacock agrees.
Yes, indeed he does. He always has much to contribute to any conversation. But the sense of the sacred is the thing which interests the artist, and the sacred is always a fundamentally real thing. And,
but then you have to talk about your definition of what is real.
No, I don't think so.
No?
I think people know what's real, and I think that they change in their idea of what's real, but they still think those things are real. We think, for instance, that germs are real. We've never seen one. We've never had anything to do with them, but they're to people they're perfectly clearly real, and they're more real than dirt. If you had a glass that was a little dirty, but you were sure was not germy, you would drink out of a dirty glass sooner than you would drink from one that somebody had a contagious disease. And that's recognizing what's real and what is fundamentally real, not what's the surface of the world. So that our faith in reality is totally a new version of a very ancient idea of what is real. When the physicists tell us that all that we see is really only various arrangements of energy, that what we see is not real. But what is real is the actual, the essential energy. And then, of course, when they call it waves of probability, say that the world is really nothing but waves of probability, it's a very dislocating and, needless to say,
disconcerting,
very hard to represent. Art, but it clearly has the same thing as completely non-figurative art. Attempts to convey something which is invisible, but art always does that. But the thing that not only is invisible, but it's very difficult for the artist to make it visible at all. So, but there's never any landscape unless there's a feeling that the natural world has divine origin. And that sense of divinity may be, you see, it's very interesting because of the great development of landscape painting in the Western world in the 19th century. It begins in the 16th century, but it doesn't take hold on the imagination in the same way. So in the 18th century, it begins to, what it tends to be sort of pastoral images, usually with shepherds and stuff. And then, of course, the 19th century just becomes what art is, to such an extent that for many people, they think, if they think art, they think landscape. And if they think artist, they think artist finding a landscape, which is essentially what the photographers still have to do because of the limitation of the medium. But I know I was very conscious of it when people came up here. Their assumption was that I enjoyed it and bought it on account of the landscape potential, which is perfectly understandable. I think that's really what artists do, and that is exactly. And the artists that people see at work are landscapers. People sitting out somewhere with a canvas and camp chair painting, and that they know that immediately that's an artist, and they think that's what all artists do who don't do portraits. And since almost no one does portraits at the present time, it just falls due to landscape to be the thing that people know that people do if they do something which is in any way representational. That's what they expect it to be. And otherwise it's modern art, which is not representational to them, which is interesting. I don't know. I don't think it's a matter of publicity or public or advertising in the biggest sense, making people aware. I think people immediately recognize modern art and would call it modern art if it is non-representational and if it is ugly. If it is harsh and ugly and awkward and so on, then they recognize that as modern, and they're perfectly willing to accept it as modern. That's the way it is, It's a very funny thing, though. The range of art at our time is enormous. I mean, it's just enormous. And some of the greatest, the best artists of our time are representational artists. Magritte, I think, is one of them. And of course, Picasso never abandoned the human form, never, in all of his permutations and combinations. He never made an abstract painting in his life. Not one. So, and yet people would think of him immediately as modern. And of course, there's just no end of other examples of the time. You see, the thing about modern art is that it's enormously varied. It's not like, say, Florentine art, 15th century, where there was a recognition of what it was meant to be, and everybody was delighted to know that and to conform to it. It's very, and of course in the Middle Ages, actually always patronage decides what the artist is going to do. And one of the sad things is that patronage is not respected, and the artist is respected, which is, if that had been true in the Middle Ages, or in the Middle Ages, or in the Renaissance, none of this would have happened. I mean, nothing would have been done. But patronage determines what it is, and our patronage is a very peculiar, special kind, because it depends a great deal on what's written by theoreticians, and therefore it has a kind of remoteness and also enormously varied expression. can hold a great number of theories about art and prove all of them from the history of art, but you can't make one that is firm enough to make it really work. So what you have is just an enormous range of variety. Becomes kind of, and I think there's a real absence of only very, very few people who recognize that they are patrons, and that as patrons they determine a lot of the direction of art. Now, you see, this is perfectly clear in something like advertising, where where it's a business. I mean, where if this image that the advertiser works out, the artist in the advertising business, isn't effective, then they don't buy it. And
it's almost like that's a parallel in a way to the old. It's almost as if that's the closest parallel we have to the patrons.
Oh yes, it is. It is. It's business.
Yeah.
But business doesn't have. See, the trouble with that at the present time is that the artist has such an exalted and perfectly false image that the patron is becomes subservient. And he asks the artist, now I actually know that this is true, that I knew someone who was a curator of a very prominent museum, and he regularly asked the artists what he should show. And the museum, of course, becomes a patron, but it's a patron who has almost no personal taste or personal decision, and it's the result is that the artist really doesn't know where to go, and doesn't know what to do for the most part. I mean, if he wants to be known as an artist, it's very interesting.
It's really interesting,
difficulty.
and in such a short time period, really.
Yeah, it is very short.
That change.
Yeah.
That it's gone full circle like that.
And in fact, you can, not only can, but many people do, in talking about art from the 18th century, from the 19th century right on through, really, to the present time, a particular artist dominates for about 10 years. And a particular style dominates for about 10 years. Then there's a change from it, a revolt from it. And that was very clear, the abstract expressionist movement, which occurred in the 50s. And by the 60s, no artists wanted to be abstract expressionists, including the abstract expressionists, all of whom turned either to suicide or to the making of an image. And some of them turned to, de Kooning famously with his images of women, which were hideous, terrible, and Philip Guston, who turned to, with really great, understandable influence. Hi. He turned to cartooning.
This is the bill for this.
That's what?
The bill for this stuff I got for Demi.
Oh, wonderful.
Plus that includes...
You didn't pay it. You did pay it.
Yeah.
Yeah. That includes what?
That includes the B1 we had for May Day.
Oh, well, that's good.
Anyway, there's no
that's
bill.
Good. I'm glad that's good. That's fine. Thank you.
Okay.
Don, I wonder if you'd go up. There's a hummingbird that's probably by now dead, but it's trying to get out of the porch and up the house.
Up the house? Okay.
Because it thinks that
the skylight
is the way out, and he's just exhausting himself up and down, up and down. And you're tall enough, I think, to just reach up and catch him, and he's absolutely fixated on that. You could catch him quite easily.
Yeah.
But he may be out by now.
Hopefully a cat hasn't got him by now.
What?
Hopefully a cat hasn't got him by now.
Well, he's too high up.
Until he gets tired and comes down low.
You know, I know it. He may drop, but it'll probably kill him anyway.
Here, Demi. Come and get your flea stuff. Oh, boy. Come here.
I just did that for my cat yesterday.
What?
I just gave my cat the advantage yesterday.
Oh, good. I tell you.
Great.
Oh, Demi, it's not. You don't act like that. You know well. That 10 years, 1940s, was a kind of curious, romantic period. And very much romantic. It was either nostalgic, or in various ways it was the taste and the artists were romantic. And that is, they liked the dramatic scene. They liked a certain darkness and all of these things. There was a painter named Alexander Brooke that all of the young people in the 1940s turned to as a great mentor. And I think in the 1950s he was totally forgotten, and as far as I know, is forgotten up to this moment.
Yeah.
But everybody was thought in terms of the way he painted. And of course before that, the 10 years from 1930 to 1940 was completely industrial, communist, great excitement about all kinds of scenes of ash, like a revival of ash cans, scenes of poverty, scenes of industrial waste, scenes of
Degradation.
Pitiful people in the South and farmers and great nostalgia about the farm, about the agricultural world.
Agrarian lifestyle.
Actually, by that time, the agricultural world was an industrial world, and became more and more so, of course. Till now, it's an aspect of industry, not nothing like farm. And the easiest way you can think of that is the difference between a farmer who is standing or walking behind or riding on a riding plow behind two horses plowing a field, and the present-day farmer who sits in an air-conditioned tractor and with his cellular phone next to him, listening to music. And I mean, he's no way different from a factory worker. It's just a very profound difference that makes the whole feeling about farm and the whole everything an aspect of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, the land is something to be tamed. It's just...
Yes, it's a very an extraordinary thing. But if you're riding around in an air-conditioned tractor, enormous power, I have no idea what 5,000 horsepower, or 3,000 or whatever
it is.
as opposed to being back of two sweaty, nice horses whose natures and personality you know perfectly well as you know your wife, as well as you know your children, because you know that they are individuals and that they have certain quirks, and you've gotten used to them or not gotten used to them. And, the whole thing, you're dealing with a living creature. You're a living creature dealing with a living creature, aiming to bring from the land the food for both of them, and that difference is so profound. It's just unimaginably profound. And of course, there are always people who are trying to return to that, because it is, of course, it's much more pleasing and satisfying to have a emotional and spiritual relation to what you're doing, which in turn has such a relation to you. I know that people have very strong emotional and spiritual relation to machines, of people who care about them. But I think it's not likely that the machine has the same response to you that you have to it. So there.
You certainly hear about that with a lot of people with their cars.
Yeah.
People have that kind of connection. They think they're cars, but it's such an extenuation of that split that really happened kind of with the Renaissance.
Yeah.
It just
continues. It's a idea of science which believes that there is such a thing as impersonality, and therefore
as impersonality,
and believes that there is such a thing as the ability to turn everything into a machine, which is what we tend to do. It's very hard for people to talk about people except in terms of machine by now. Used to be, of course, unthinkable. But we speak about the mechanism of the heart with absolutely no embarrassment or faint dubiety or anything else. We just say, well, the mechanism of the heart is such and such, or this mechanism is broken down of the lungs or whatever. We think of them as machine. We think of ourselves as machine. And this is it's unavoidable for most people because they don't have any other thing to think of what we are. But it makes for a very special and different kind of world. But in the 30s, there was great nostalgia about, and also a sense of the conditions on farms must be changed, and they were changed. And in the 40s, that was not, was really a turn to a very romantic conception of the world. And then, of course, with the 50s, the abstract expressionists took over. I mean, it's really a fascinating thing, because if you weren't an abstract expressionist, you continued to paint in the manner, you were just totally forgotten. That was it. That was the end of it. That was not anything. You had no real connection with anything. And I do not think that this is the result of the galleries. I think this is a result of part of the artists themselves who lost faith in the image. They totally lost faith in it as having any power. And of course, perfectly ludicrous things as advertising uses nothing but the image. And it has enormous power. And so that they don't even sell a car without somebody standing, or used not to, somebody standing beside it. Now they make the car so mysterious, they don't show it as a real car, but as some kind of embodiment of some sense of speed and shininess. And
spirit almost.
And it's really quite remarkable. And interestingly, all the cars begin to look the same.
Oh, yeah.
Because the image of the car becomes the thing that's
it's desired, not the car itself.
Not the car itself, and it's something which the car aspires to be, but and insofar as it can, it does. But it is it's very funny if you look at it. You used not to be able to sell a car without a woman standing beside it, or a handsome couple or something. And for most things, the most powerful tool of advertising is the face of a woman. It is just there's almost nothing that you can't sell with the face of a woman. And if you go in the supermarket and look at the magazines, almost all of them have a woman on the cover. And it doesn't matter what the thing is about. It may be Mechanics Illustrated, but it's still we'll have that. So it's a very, very curious thing for the artist to reject the thing of greatest power, and which has always been of greatest power, and then naturally it would. I mean, we, as human beings, we're drawn to human beings.
Yeah. It's just so.
And of course, then after the 50s, you have the whole comic book world, Roy Lichtenstein, and that's for 10 years, and I know the 70s that began to break down, began to reach everybody, and therefore really to break down. It's a very very strange business, and you have a kind of return to Dadaism in the 70s and 80s. And I think it's a very interesting thing, because you have in the 19th century you have the great kind of Courbet, and you have all of the artists following a romantic realism. That is, they use a realistic approach and are interested in exactly the same way that science is. In the 19th century, the scientist was a naturalist. He felt that the secret of reality was in nature, and that if you studied it carefully, you'd be able to see it. And so they would sit and study, just one animal or one group of animals, just endlessly, arranging their whole life to do that. Or in a laboratory, the same thing, trying to extract from nature the things which they felt were the secret of life, the meaning of things. And it produced, of course, some very great writers. The thing about the ants and so on. And a great revelation of nature just by the studious observation of it. And the artist does exactly the same thing. Studiously observes the natural world in a way that is more impersonal, aims to be more impersonal.
Is it? I don't think it's quite with the same intention as finding the answers.
I think it's revealing him to what they think of as
But do you think that the scientist observes with the same eye as the artist does?
Oh, I think we only have one eye. Two, possibly. But
hopefully.
But in his actual observation, he has to have the same attention and the same. That's why you have great drawings, painting, color, all kinds of things. That's all. Well, of course, that's why you have Audubon. But there are other equally devoted people who, and of course, almost the whole of American art was devoted to the extraordinariness of our continent. Huge, wonderful things like Niagara Falls, really a whole new visual imagery for nature as something sublime, some romantic idea. But it's after the great realist period of 1850 to 1860, then you have the whole development of that, and in 1870 you have the great Impressionist exhibit, you see, which is still devoted to nature, but it believes that all that we can ever know about nature we know through our eyes, and that the character of our looking at things makes a certain kind of appearance, and that actually great thing that the Impressionists believed was that you could not focus on but one thing at once. And so the rest of what we see is a blur. The peripheral vision is a blur. And so that's exactly what they painted. And it's also something which people enormously enjoy, which I don't think it's because they recognize it, but when you think of the extent of reproductions of Monet's garden, you know, you get an idea of how much this must please how many people all over the world, actually. So it's a very, very extraordinary thing.
Why do you think it's so pleasing?
But
Why do you think the Impressionists are so pleasing to so many people?
I think because they're attractive. They're the last paintings that were harmonious. And when the next 10 years, in the 80s, when the Expressionists began to appear, like Cézanne and so on, they as Cézanne famously said, of course, that the natural world is hard and not just a fuzzy image, but a hard reality. And he said that he wanted to paint the way things were if the sun wasn't shining, or if the light wasn't striking them. What were they like in the dark? And you see, that's just a complete reversal, because the whole Impressionist thing was light. That was what made anything real. And so you have a business of painting a haystack. And then when they painted the haystack, again, identifying themselves with the scientists, they would write the time of day, the type of climate, if it was overcast or if it was cold or if it was whatever, and the time of day, and down to the minutes, so it would be like 10:15 a.m. And then the next day, because light creates the reality, they could go to the same haystack, and did go to the same haystack, at a different hour of the day, on a different day. But write that down. And see, it was exactly the same passion to extract from the natural world its secret or whatever, or its reality or whatever, and that people, everybody felt could be done by observation, by close and impersonal observation. The Impressionists had no desire to have their work ever distinguished by any kind of personal expression. They had absolutely no desire to do that. In fact, a strong desire not to do it. They had no respect for that. They had respect for painstaking observation, but real observation, not what you'd call realistic painting, where which seems to be the result of observation and is, but not under certain conditions. It has nothing to do with light, nothing to do with the weather. But it is a pattern of thought that really has not changed, because it's a great scientific pattern in which the person making the thing has no, or person observing a thing must not intrude. And if it does intrude, then it becomes false. Well, this is a very peculiar thing, because it subjects them mostly to terrible agony.
Impossible.
Yes, of whether it's possible, or whether they can do it, or, whether they were perhaps so you get this insane business of effort for something that really has no, it has no reality, because you're positing that it's more real if you don't know anything about it than if you do, which is a really quite extraordinary conclusion. Oh dear, but it does have has very strong results in everything. I mean, the way people raise children and everything. It certainly affects all education and probably a great deal of legislation. So it's very pervasive, and there's nothing really. Though in art, in the next 10 years, you had the opposite, where the personal expression was the thing which was the most important. And
at the turn of the century.
What?
At the turn of the century.
Yeah, well before that, 1880 and 90, which is the time of the expressionists, Cézanne and Renoir, all of whose paintings you can recognize immediately as being this person's painting. And whereas the Impressionists, you cannot tell Monet from any number of other lesser, actually unknown painters. So it's a very radical difference that happens. And then in the 90s, the next 10 years, this was carried to an extreme. And it was what was called the fauves, who are just wild beasts, described as such, because they were interested only in the expressive values of things, only in the very violent, strong, powerful, aiming to be powerful thing. And it's a very clearly divided time, when the thing goes out of fashion, and then and it's only preserved by the lesser artists. And they keep on painting that way the rest of their lives, but it's very clear in the abstract expressionists that they don't do that they do change. The major ones do change when the change comes about. And I think it's because of weariness, or because of boredom with the thing. It becomes tired and boring.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And so then you get somebody like suddenly telling us that the comic books are a great source of art. Certainly has more truth in it than abstract art. Comic books are the comic image, which is not real and not, it's just unbelievably unreal. I always am so delighted to remember Dick Tracy, which was, he became a whole figure for people, and is the most rudimentary face that you'd ever see. I mean, it was fully as rudimentary as the happy face, only it was not happy. It was mostly shown in profile, so it made it even easier.
But
and yet people cheerfully believed in him, and even the absolutely total mystification. I think I do believe that art has extraordinary power. Not necessarily good art, not necessarily a good power, but it has enormous power. And even when it's, in a way you'd think it was unbelievable, it becomes believable. But I remember reading when there was a figure in Dick Tracy who was called Flathead, because his head was perfectly flat, and which is reasonable. And he finally died. I think was killed. But people all over the world sent money for his funeral and sent letters saying that he should have an honorable funeral, and everybody should realize that he was under the difficulties of having this flat head.
Well, that goes back to what you were saying the first time we talked, and how people relate to television.
Yes,
even though it's silly and shallow.
Art becomes real to people. No matter how evidently unreal it is, it just becomes real. And this is a great, great mystery. I mean, it really is. If you've ever seen a kabuki dance, for instance, to anybody who is not Japanese and who is not familiar with it, it is the most unreal thing in the world. The movement is so stylized and so minute. I mean, least finger raises, it changes the whole meaning. Well, you've got to have a total familiarity to know what's going on. Otherwise, it's masked people in extraordinary costumes that are much larger than they are and more monumental. And there they are. But this is about the deepest passions and the strongest and strangest stories that are part of the Japanese mythology. And it's just totally real and absolutely absorbing. I don't know, it's very strange.
It's very strange.
It is. It simply is that we as human beings are susceptible to art. Just as we might be susceptible to alcohol. We just are plain susceptible. But animals can be made dependent on alcohol, but they can't be made dependent on art. And they can, in fact, really recognize anything as art. So it's it's absolutely our thing. It's what we live by, really, literally live by. And can't escape.
Mary, is that your phone? I think your phone's ringing.
I don't hear it.
I hear it ringing. It's been going on for a while.
Oh, that probably is.
Do you want me to look?
Well, I
no,
think
there it stopped.
Yeah.
Sure, it stopped.
I ought to have my phone out wherever I am, but I don't.
Well, it's hard to be shadowed by machines all the time.
I know.
Well, that's probably enough for today.
Something somewhat related to the divine. Because of the awe that inspires. Half of it. It's like Hannah, who has half a retrieving instinct. Right? You have half of it, you know how to create, you know how to make more of whatever, and how to kill. Maybe separated. You have only one. You only know how to kill things, or only know how to promote things and create them. On the side of life or the side of death.
Maybe that's partially what our dilemma is, our modern dilemma, is that we've been so split that the people will only know how to kill, or only know how to create.
Yeah.
Because I know I sense in a lot of people, myself included, just the tendency to want to nurture and support. When the opposite is absolutely necessary. You have to know when to destroy things as well.
That's right. Because their life and death are absolutely mutually dependent on each other. If there weren't any death, there wouldn't be any room for life. If there weren't any life, there wouldn't be any death.
And you see, it's echoed in so many areas, and we've been brought along with it. Medicine, for instance.
It's true.
We just continue to want to perpetuate life, to avoid disease.
And Oh, well, I think we're really actually in a very peculiar state about death. I think it's interesting that people no longer think they know the difference between life and death. You know, it's very hard to pronounce somebody dead. And actually, it is a narrow line. And we've held on to people through technology that otherwise would have been dead. And on the other hand, people in the 19th century, and undoubtedly before that as well, but known examples, thought people were dead who weren't. And they buried a great many people who were living. And of course this became a kind of nightmare for people who had any knowledge of it or suspicion of it. And it was one of the reasons why the people would sit up with a corpse maybe for 3 days.
To be certain.
Which is the opposite of the Jewish system, which is supposed to be buried the same day. And they also, one of the things that made embalming so become fashionable, because embalming does not preserve the body, but about 3 days. And it ensures that the person is dead because it removes all the blood and puts in embalming fluid. So it became very fashionable. And now it's not fashionable, it's just what happens, you know, it's not, but nobody thinks of it as something which just prevents them from being buried alive. Which of course has always been the most terrible punishment that could be imposed on people. Look at the peacock with his lovely display. Turn around, mister, the back view is not everybody's favorite, though I like it. Anybody who thinks that the hens care about that is crazy. They don't even look.
They don't care.
See, there's a hen that he was making all that effort for. And she's working on some food.
Head to the ground and taking away.
Oh, he's still working. He makes his feathers shiver. You think that's going to fix her for sure.
It's funny how we've so turned it around.
What?
Well, humans, it's the woman who does the shimmering.
Yeah. No, I don't. I think the men do.
Well,
too.
they do it too, yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Men are greater for display.
Yeah.
That's possible in women. But in almost all animals, the woman chooses. I think that's true of everything.
It's true.
The men do something to try to make her. I know lobsters, lady lobsters, sit in their little cave, and the men just walk by. And if she invites one of them in, but she has to invite them in. They can't just come in and make themselves at home. And it's very, of course, the scientists who sit around observing this find it very difficult to figure out why she chooses, Jim instead of Harry. It's a very funny thing.
It's an odd world.
I know it
isn't it? It's just incredibly odd.